Life is a highway, and on it there will be many chicken sandwiches. But there's only one McCrispy. So go ahead and hit the turn signal if you know about this juicy gem of a detour.
So, as I keep reading, this is what he says. But inasmuch as Hephaestus and Athena were of like nature, being born of the same father, that's interesting, born of the same father, and agreeing moreover in their love of wisdom and of craftsmanship, they both took for their joint portion this land, Greece, as being naturally congenial and adapted for virtue and wisdom. And so here you have Plato, like, loving the fact that the Greeks are all wise and everything. And he explains it by the fact that Hephaestus and Athena are the gods that were allotted to Greece. Now, why does that matter? Because Athena is a woman. And if this is the same worldview that we find in Deuteronomy 32, then here you have, and it's obviously not biblical, but you have clear proof that in very early days, they were considering that the sons of God also had females that were a part of the story.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, that if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Hey, welcome back to Blurry Creatures. Happy New Year. Glad to have you guys with us. Embarking on our 4th year as a podcast. Thank you guys so much for all the support you've given us over the years. Today we are on an episode with Doug Van Dorn and Dr. Judd Burton on the goddess, the female deities that are in ancient history and in the Bible. I try to make sense of that. Oftentimes people say some pretty black and white statements with regards to angels and deities, so we're going to unpack that. Just want to let you know that there are a few VIP tickets left to our Costa Rica trip at the end of the month. And Joel Muddamale is going to be a special guest along with Tim Albarino. So if you want to get tickets to that, head to our website. We'll throw a little flyer on there for you, and you can still make it. Thank you so much to the members who support the show week in and week out and help us do this and produce this podcast. And we couldn't do it without you, and we're forever grateful. We have a lot more content lined up and some events coming up this year, so stay tuned, and let's get Doug and Judd on this one. Let's get started. Welcome back to the podcast, Doug and Judd. You know, Luke, it's actually pretty hard to say those two names together. If you try it 5 times, you're going to screw it up.
Jug and Dud.
It's like an ancient chimera of names.
And you think we get it right. You guys are, some of our oldest friends in this space. We're grateful to have you on. You've been on a number of episodes. You guys took chances on us when we were just getting started. And we're going to be forever grateful for that.
Well, never take chances on you.
Yeah, thanks.
Tonight, I think you're going to be taking the chance on us, you guys.
That's right. We are. But it's great to have you guys. Good to have you back. One of our biggest episodes and most popular episodes is the Demonology episode where you guys teamed up. And, of course, you both have been on multiple times, some of our most frequent guests on Blurry Creatures. So the illustrious Doug Van Dorn, brand new website, illustrious Doug Van Dorn, and the man who needs no introduction, Dr. Judd Burton, and his dulcet tones from down in Merkel, Texas. Great to have you back. This is going to be a fun one. We made jokes the first time we recorded this about it being a sequel. Now we're part 3. It's a trilogy, right? This is the Rumble in the Jungle. This is Marty and Doc Brown in the Old West. Unfortunately for our audience, they didn't hear the second one. It was really good.
Sorry about that. Things happened,
but here we are. Here we're all here, and
we shot the movie. We need to replace the actor. There's a Back to the Future joke in there somewhere.
There's deja vu going on somewhere here,
right? I mean, if we're in the Rocky series, this is the Clubber Lang episode, right? We're right before he goes to Russia. So,
well, we can start this one out and talk about how this episode kind of came about. Now that we're friends, we kind of text each other and we have these conversations going. And you guys kind of hit us up and said, we have this idea of doing a topic about the goddess and sort of female deities, and what does that mean? What's the overall conversation we can have there? And the church is sort of opposed to it. Most Christians are still on the fence that if there were male angels that could mate with females, that there are any female angels at all. So we have a lot to unpack in this episode. So you guys wanted to do a whole episode on this. So are there female angels and deities, Luke? What do you think?
Well, we know from the historic record, and I'm going to let the experts talk on this, but we know that as far back as you go, there are, from the Sumerians and Babylonians to the Canaanite religion, which of course was adjacent to ancient Israel, which would have been the authors of the Old Testament, where Moses would have bumped into the Canaanites a lot. In fact, they bumped into them and took their land, right? So they had at least three major goddesses in that religion, and one where I want to know we're going to talk about tonight, especially because I think what's fascinating about discussing what we consider to be the old gods or the pantheons of gods and relating to the sons of gods that we find in the biblical narrative is that there's a lot of crossover, as we've talked about in the show with both of you gentlemen, about the pantheons of gods and how they are related and renamed as you go from civilization to civilization. And a lot of our show deals with a lot of what we consider to be the divine council worldview, really popularized by Dr. Michael Heiser, but, ancient, not a new thing, right? I mean, but the idea that the sons of God, mentioned multiple times in the Bible, were involved in the Gen 6 incident, if we want to call it. That sounds like a punk band, the Gen 6 incident. Maybe it's one that needs to happen. But they stood for joy at the creation of the earth, according to Job, and then among the dividing of the nations, Deuteronomy 32, they were allotted, post-flood, some of these sons of God were allotted governorship or dominion over the nations that had turned their back on Yahweh. So we have these characters, right? And within these characters, we have some interesting things that go on it. And so I'm very excited about this episode. What we like to do on Blurry Creatures, if you're listening for the first time, and if you're not, this is just a reminder. We like to have discussions about things that we believe should be discussed, and thought exercises and stretch ourselves to think about and look at the scriptures and what the scripture, not maybe, but actually what the scriptures say and what they said originally, and what the authorship's intent was, and also their cultural and environmental, background in that space. And so enough from Luke Rogers. Welcome to the show, Doug Van Dorn, Dr. Judd Burton. What are your thoughts on Bigfoot?
10 minutes in.
I'm kidding. You guys have given your thoughts. Where do you want to start, Doug?
Well, you just said that the whole idea of a thought exercise, and in some ways that's kind of what this is going to be. Not completely, but to some degree. This idea came to my mind because I've had so many people that, and for one reason or another, will say that, the Bible only talks about male angels, and so therefore they conclude that there's no such thing as female angels. And, so that gets into what is an angel. There's only one class of angels. Just because the Bible says that there's only male, it only supposedly mentions male angels. Does that mean that the negative is that you can infer that there are no females just because it doesn't mention them? So a lot of things going on here. And, when Judd and I were talking about this, we thought it might be better to go from the more concrete to the more speculative. So kind of maybe begin by just mentioning a couple of demonic entities that are female that are in the Bible. And, you could almost say that the Bible only mentions male giants. And so because it only mentions male giants, does that mean that there's no female giants? And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? Because these are creatures that the women are giving birth to, and to think that there's only they're only giving birth to male giants. It doesn't make any sense at all. So, of course, we would expect to find female demonic entities, and we do find a couple of those. One of them is in the strange list that I think we talked about in the very first show that Judd and I did together in Isaiah 34, and you find them in Micah chapter 1. They're called the daughters of the ostrich, which is really bizarre. Nobody really knows what they are, but the Septuagint translates that as a siren. So the little mermaid, they're not usually dudes, right? You know, these are like demonic entities in the sense that they're half-breed angelic creature and probably animal of some kind. And you guys have talked about that a ton. I think we've talked about that too. There's another one in Zechariah 5 that actually has two creatures. Zechariah 5 starts off by talking about this leaden cover that is lifted, and there's a woman sitting in a basket. And then it says that she is wickedness. And so she's thrust up back into the basket. And then they put the lead weight back on it so she can't get out. Well, this story is very much like the story of Pandora in Greek mythology. It's got differences. You know, in that story, the gods are the one that made Pandora, each of the Olympians kind of adding something to her aspect. But you know, here God is the one who's completely sovereign over it. But nevertheless, it's a Pandora-like figure that's female, and she's called a woman. She's called wickedness, which reminds us of kind of the whore of Babylon in Revelation, actually. But then just a verse later, it mentions these two creatures that almost nobody really even knows they're there. It says, I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, two women coming forward. The wind was in their wings. So these probably aren't demonic entities or some sort of heavenly creatures. They have wings, so we often think of angels like that. Even if it's just metaphorical, they're flying around as messengers. And what are they doing? They had wings like the wings of a stork. They lifted the basket between heaven and earth, and then they carry it off to Babylon, where wickedness will be unloaded on the Babylonians. So here we actually do, I think, have mention of female angels. They're called stork women. And for whatever reason, they're just never really talked about. And then you have a fourth one that's worth mentioning. She's also found in Isaiah 34 with the sirens. She's the Lilith. Judd could talk a lot about the Lilith. She's like this vampiric creature, this night hag that steals babies and all kinds of horrible things. She's kind of a crossover between a demon and also a god, because she's found in later Jewish mythology, in the story of Adam and Eve, as the one who, I think, the mother of Cain or something like that.
Life is a highway, and on it there will be many chicken sandwiches. But there's only one McCrispy. So go ahead and hit the turn signal if you know about this juicy gem of a detour.
Yeah, she refuses to take the submissive position to Adam. That's part of her notoriety, which is why Lilith has become such a symbol of feminism.
Layla, you know the song Layla?
Layla,
yeah.
I mean, that's Clapton. That's just the same name as Lilith. So she's made her way into pop culture.
Wow. I was thinking of Strange Brew by Cream. Would be apropos as well, because she's a witch of trouble in electric blue, and her own mad mind, she's in love with you.
There it is.
He did it.
You said you were going to drop it on us.
You did, and you did that way early, man.
You did it really. As long as we're making references, I think of Billy Madison when they light the poop on fire on the porch, and he says, "Don't tell me my business, devil woman. It's poop again."
I want you to sing Rhiannon from Stevie Nicks next, bro. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, how would angels reproduce if they didn't do it like they didn't have children like we do? How would there be more angels?
Yeah, so this is the speculative question, right? And that we want to kind of start with the idea that, first of all, there just simply are female creatures that fit the bill.
Yeah, you're jumping ahead, Nate.
Sorry,
but it's
I like to jump ahead.
I mean, that's really the question that started this whole thing for me. Reason why I pitched it to Judd and then want to get on here. We'll talk. I think a lot about that. But just to kind of lay the foundation, if people can get it in their minds that there's stork women in Zechariah 5 and they're angelic creatures, that kind of shuts the door on this idea that there are no women angels in the first place. So now you kind of have to deal with the bigger question of how could it happen? And that's where you can start to speculate. But if people don't have it in their minds at the very beginning that there are or could be female angels, then, the discussion just never can get off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where my mind starts. My mind in this conversation kind of starts Adam and Eve and why God created the female. Like, we could talk about that a little bit. What does the female say about God? Is Adam is he created with the ability to reproduce before she's created? There's a lot of weird questions that can pop up around, I think for Christians, is just these two different things. We're so opposite, but we're so attracted to each other. And what does that say about God, And one thing we talk about a lot about our show is how how earth mirrors heaven, heaven on earth, and there's this similarities here. So I think we could talk about a lot of those things. I don't know. I'm not up on my Greek history, so it's hard to, when you guys rattle up all these names, it's like a lot of stuff I don't know, but it is fascinating to think that there are so many female deities. We were talking about last night, Jezebel, we could probably talk. There's just all these names that just like in our language, but we don't even think about it.
Well, and I think you make an interesting point, Doug, when you talk about the demonic, right? I mean, I know that the demonic's, MO is fear and deception. But if we're to biblically understand the demonic, we talked about this in the demonology episode with you both, is that they are the disembodied spirits, the Nephilim, right? Or the giants. And then that you have demonic entities that appear or present, if you will, if you want to sort of table this or couch this, present as feminine, then you sort of have an issue there too, unless they're just pretending. I mean, you could always go there and you could write it off, and that's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. But what if they're not pretending? And what if the reason we have these demonic entities that present themselves as feminine is because they were at one point embodied in a woman?
There is a swath of material to draw on from there. The literature that we get from both the Dark Ages and the corners of Europe that were literate, and the medieval literature talk about the incubus and the succubus. There were these demons that would very much in the pattern of a Lilith, because Lilith also drained the virility out of men, was another one of her attributes. But these, of course, are personalities that are reflected in the gods and demons of even classical antiquity and even farther back than that. This sort of idea is latent. It's prehistoric, in fact. These ideas have been around quite some time, not only just in the religious ideation of humanity, but also in the real experiences that people are having with these entities. So you've got to kind of, at least in the corpus of our folklore and our mythology, and indeed the text record, the historical record, we have accounts of people's experiences with these entities from the unseen realm, as it were. The fact that there's such a recurrence, just outside of just a strictly theological conversation, or a conversation just looking at this through the lens of the Bible, should be enough cause for pause on one hand. But when you walk it through the divine counsel worldview, biblical perspective, then it does become a question that's worth consideration, which is why we're talking about it right now. I think it's a necessary and quite frankly overdue conversation, which is why Doug and I have been talking about it for a while, and we pitched it to you guys.
Yeah.
So Judd, when you hear these four creatures that I mentioned, like, do we have any reason to think that they're anything other than women? Not getting to the goddess at this point, but just these creatures.
Yeah, not really. I mean, not just the biblical tradition, but we could even generalize it as the ancient Near Eastern perspective on all this. Lilith, she shows up all over the ancient Near East, Lilitu, and Mesopotamian mythology. So it's clear to an ancient Near Eastern audience that she's a female, and that certainly seems to be pretty explicit in the Old Testament references to Lilith, as it were. So I would say that in the list of entities that you rounded off there, I don't think that there's much wiggle room there. They are female, they are feminine, And using the Septuagint as a kind of clarifying lens for the stork women is really interesting, because you noted that the rendering in the Septuagint is siren.
Well, that's the daughters of the ostrich, but yeah, they're the sirens.
Yeah, right. The daughters of the ostrich, exactly. I was thinking, for some reason, I was thinking stork women, but yeah, we get that sort of clarification when we look at these kinds of things through the Septuagint, whether they're giants or any other kinds of blurry creatures.
Hey,
the Septuagint is such a valuable tool because you've got these the rabbis that worked on this thing in the 3rd and 2nd century BC were Jewish, but they were abundantly familiar. They were Hellenized Jews. They were abundantly familiar with the Greek culture, the nuances of the language, the mythology, so they knew the exact Greek analog to use.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that that's a strong mark for verification that those entities are in fact female.
Before moving on, Judd, you sent me to a video like right when I first met you. It's this crazy, insane video. I don't know if you guys have seen it or not, but it takes place in the desert somewhere in the Middle East. And these guys come up to this creature in the middle of the night with their car lights on it. And the creature is very clearly a woman and some sort of a crazy night hag. And she's like, it's like she's glowing in the dark. Like she's not really there. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen. And it kind of reminds me of the idea of a Lilith, of a night hag. And there's no question that looking at that figure, that it's anything other than a woman.
Yeah. And that whole, I'm trying to remember that guy's name that does that, but he's kind of a paranormal investigator in the Middle East. But he did another video where he found a male witch who was living in a similar kind of conclusion. He actually talked with this thing, and he looked like he was kind of scarred or burned. And the fellow asked him what happened here, and he said that the jinn did this to me.
Mm.
As the demons referred to in Islamic tradition. But that I didn't waste any time in sending that first video to Doug, because I knew it would catch his eye and maybe disturb him a little too.
It's completely crazy.
I like where we're starting though, because I think it's so important, as you started saying, Doug, that we create the parameters around this thought exercise and we ground it in the scripture. And what we're talking about is these entities that are mentioned in the Bible. And we've talked about this with Tim Alberino a bit too, right? Very pragmatic me. And I like talking about this because I think it's important, because I think that a lot of people will knee-jerk in the church, especially, and not to bang on the church at all, but I think there's this medieval thinking, as Judd would say, that we have this visceral knee-jerk reaction that says that the angels just took the form of men. And so then they got all of the equipment they needed. And because of that, they were able to do what they do. But men and women don't create giants. Right? It just doesn't.
Yeah.
Unless you're Shaq's parents, right? I mean,
kind of talked about that in the first episode. Is just like, okay, so let's throw that out there, right? And I think you're right, Luke. I think that we're constantly up against half of sort of mainstream Christianity that just doesn't want to accept any of these weird narratives, because they just think that the Bible is sort of giving you everything and like an encyclopedia, and we know all this stuff. But if an angel took on a human form, yeah, then they would have a human's genetics, and you don't. You have angelic genetics, which creates this hybrids, and that's where the demigods come from, and the Nephilim and the giants and all these other, however you look at that. That sounds more fantastical to me than there are angels and they're created a certain way and they have a biology and they do what they do. Then they can just be these magical shapeshifters, like that sounds more crazy to me than. But they say that we're the crazy ones, right? It's like, you believe they're magical shapeshifters. I just believe they're a more advanced human, Or
we create a little lower. Now, Doug, walk us through this, because I know you've got a very good progression, as you will, and I think you call this the poof theory.
Yeah.
But I think this is important, because I think talking through this, because you hear this, if you start to listen for it, you hear it. Right, it's like, well, they just took on the form of men. But if we look at the biblical narrative, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. We talk about Sodom. We talk about a lot of other things in the context of the angelic race.
Yeah. So this is this is a very common thing to hear people say, that angels in the Old Testament took the form of humans. And so there's two things going on. First, it's like what Nate just said, they took the form. So in other words, they weren't that somehow on the other realm. It's just kind of a shell or a husk that they put on, like a mask or something. They're not really that. And then the second thing is that people think that they're human, but in fact, they're not human, not technically. So Hebrew has two words that we translate into English as the word man. One is the word Adam, and that word is only used of human beings. It's never, ever used of angels. The second word is the word Ish, and Ish is used of humans, but it's also used of angels. So somehow we don't share Adam, but we share Ish, and Ish is also a man. So when the three angels come to Abraham in Genesis 18, Abraham instantly recognizes who they are. They don't even have to say anything. And the question is, well, why? Well, if you go and read Pseudepigrapha, and you can take any stock in it at all, maybe you can't, but maybe you can. And Dead Sea Scrolls, well, they didn't look exactly like us. They looked humanoid, but they didn't look exactly human. Like their flesh is a little different. They're a bit taller. They usually describes like 8 feet tall or something like that, which kind of explains the Nephilim actually to some degree. They're what you guys talk about, there's the Nordics, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
But, kind of slightly reptilian skin features. They're just not quite us. So they would be recognized.
Just tall Brad Pitts. Yeah, just walking around.
Go.
Great lettuce, good hair, shiny skin.
Is that a snake pun? Is that a viper pun, Brad Pitt?
Hey, look at you, man. We do this in our text threads all the time. People aren't privy to that, but we love puns. We do love puns. No, but Doug, you wrote a book on this, The Angel of the Lord.
Yeah, The Angel of the Lord.
And I want to plug it right now because you won't, but it's a great book, and so I love that you're going to sort of give us an expose on this, because I think it's important, because what we're doing is going back into the scripture and saying, people knew these weren't people.
So
walking around.
So one of those guys that comes to Abraham is the angel of the Lord. He's actually just called the Lord or Yahweh in the text most of the time, but he's the angel of the Lord. And he goes and he has his feet washed, and he eats with Adam, just as the other two angels do. And then as the story progresses, he stays behind and has a bartering discussion over how many people would it take to not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham loses. Meanwhile, the other two angels, they go to Sodom. At first, they're called angels, and then later in the story, they're called men. And this is where the men of the city want to have sex with the men who just came in, and those men are these angelic creatures. So that, just like the Genesis 6 story does, that very strongly implies that they have the genetics, whatever we want to say. They have the biology as men. That's what they are. And, so one other thing about the angel, getting to the poof theory idea, is that people somehow think that when angels come here, like I said, they take on some form, but when they go to the other side, they're like something utterly different. I don't know what they think they are, just vapors of cloud or something. I don't know. But that's not the case. Like there's a divine council over there, and they hold council in the heavenly realms, and they're embodied in some kind of a place. However we think about it, it's not like then the angel of the Lord comes here, or any of these other angels that when they leave, they just cease to exist as angels. This is what they are. This is their nature.
Yeah.
So, I think that's quite important to see that it's not just a projection that they're putting onto this world.
This is an overall discussion that we have on most of these subjects, that there's a physicality to all of the sort of the woo, supernatural, spiritual things. A lot of Christians have this problem, guys, where they think that anything they don't understand is a spiritual deception, right? So aliens and alien craft are all just demonic stuff. It's just I can't put that into my mind, and I see this amongst half the church, is that they couldn't put it in practical terms. Angels are like humans. They're close to us. We can tell that they're not like us, but maybe if you didn't look close enough, you wouldn't be able to tell. Why do we have craft? Why do we have physical bodies? Why we talk about Sasquatch and clearly they have families, We have an episode coming out this week where A little girl saw kids and two parents stealing chickens, right? And we hear these stories. So all the woo seems to physically manifest, at least in our realm. And then I think Christians think that it just sort of evaporates and disappears or becomes, not physical when it leaves our realm, or they call it dimensional. And I guess that's just, we run into this problem all the time. One of the questions I proposed to Tim is, why are they building the megaliths down here? Are they emulating something that they know in their world? Are they trying to build structures in the golden age that replicate maybe what the structures are in the heavenly realm, right? And in the book of Enoch, they come down here and they teach us all this knowledge. Where do they get it from? How do they know how to do all these things? Well, they have a physical realm where they're building stuff because they teach us metallurgy and herbology, and they teach us, the women, how to beautify themselves with colors and
smoky eyes.
Smoky. So there is another kingdom where it seems very similar to our world and what goes on here. Maybe we just have we're the 8-bit version. They're the Nintendo 64.
Right, we're a little lower than the angels. Yeah, not like what you're saying. We're the 8-bits. Yeah. No, but I think it's interesting too, to Doug's point, right? They do the things we do. They eat, they walk. And I think when you're talking about trying to conceptualize something as ethereal, right? That's really what they're saying. That, you have the whole Daniel 10 episode where it's held up, this angel's held up by the Prince of Persia. They have to walk into Sodom. They show up and they eat, and they do physical things that require sort of a physicality.
The prophet opens the guy's eyes so that he can see all the chariots all around him of the angelic realm. Right. The manna is called the food of angels.
Mm-hmm. Physical is probably the right adjective to use, but that's not to say that the physics of where they're from are completely identical.
Right.
Yes.
Very much.
Thank you, Judd. Yes, 100%. Yeah.
Well, we proposed on a recent episode that the technology they possess is also a frequency that they operate at, because we talk all the time when these UFOs are powered up, they disappear because maybe they're vibrating at a frequency that we just can't detect. And a lot of this stuff we can't detect. So it might not that there are things right, there could be things right in front of you. There could be a Sasquatch right in front of you. There could be a UFO right in front of you, but it's the technology is it's vibrating at a frequency we cannot detect. What I'm trying to say is that we're limited maybe at the fall. We can't see this realm anymore. Like we used to walk with God, and then we lost it. We downgraded, and now we can only see so many. There's so much behind the veil that we can't perceive, but we used to be able to perceive that. So we can't project our thoughts into other people, but we can receive. Many people have been communicated with entities right into their minds. So it seems like we downgraded, but we were in the garden very much like the other beings in the garden. And so I think it all makes sense because so many people are scratching their heads about, do we actually have UFO craft? Are they actually building spaceships, flying them around? Are these chariots in the Old Testament maybe related to these UFOs? Is that what they describe them as? Are these alien bodies actually real, or are they fake? But it seems that we have we have whistleblowers saying, nope, we have the physical craft, we have the bodies. And it's really hard for Christians to wrap their mind around these concepts, and specifically Genesis 6. So I know we're kind of kicking a horse here, but I think it's I don't know what is the hang up in people's minds that realm can't be like ours. Ours is completely unique, and they have to completely transform to be in our realm.
All I know is that you brought Sasquatch in twice now into a biblical angelic goddess episode, so you're almost at your quota.
You know what?
Yeah,
I'm proud of you. It's good.
Maybe one of the problems people have is that when we die, our bodies go to the ground, and so then we're spirits, whatever that means, and then we think about the resurrection, and we know that we're going to be given glorified bodies as believers. And somehow that's different than what it's going to be in this intermediate state. But it's like you still have to try and conceive of that intermediate state. And I'm not one of these guys who thinks that it's just some sort of soul sleep, that there's nothing at all happening until you receive your glorified body. So you have to conceive it in some way. So I think Judd's right. Physical is an okay word, but spiritual is also a word that is important to use there too. And the fact of the matter is we just don't know And we're trying to use modern technology, scientific language to try and understand it. And I think that that's actually can be quite helpful. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, it is a little bit different than what we have down here, but nevertheless, there's an overlap.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jesus has a resurrected body. It went somewhere. It didn't poof out of existence.
Clearly, conceptually, I mean, just it's a place that has its own politics, its own order. It's described as a kingdom. There's a divine council. There's, I mean, these are concepts that have embedded themselves in our earliest languages, basically. And so, clearly the entire revelation of the Bible from Genesis to the book of Revelation wouldn't have been given without those points of connectivity, without those similarities. So in a way, it is the way to think of them. They're perfected ideals in a way that Plato could not have even dreamed of when talking about ideals in Greek philosophy. But yeah, there are similarities, but they're these perfected, states of those kinds of concepts, and we use them in language today without even thinking about them. Certainly within the church, but even in everyday language.
Is it possible to talk about the Book of Enoch and the knowledge that we were imparted and work backwards? If they taught us to make knives and shields, that means there's war, right?
I think that's I think that's quite rational. Yeah,
I agree.
They taught us cutting of plants, so that means there's plants growing somewhere else, right?
Well, you're making bread, right? That's the idea of manna.
Well, here's an interesting one, because they also taught the smiting of the fetus in the womb.
Wow, bro. Yeah. As horrible as that is, it requires there be pregnancy.
Well, but and those are, one could be seen, the cutting of roots could be seen as herbal medicine, but Doug's example, that's a perversion of medical, so that you've got practical applicable sciences, but you also see perversions of those ideas and what the Watchers are teaching to humanity in the Genesis 6 episode.
So I think what we're really getting at here, just with all of this, is that ultimately Genesis 6 they reproduce. So if they have some sort of physicality, different overlap with what we are, it's compatible. And it seems a little bit, from our discussion and just really looking at this, it seems a little silly to think that it's just a poof taking the form of, right? So if they're compatible and if they have the biology, as you said, Doug, then the implications would be that there potentially is reproduction. And this is all thought exercise, of course, but the idea that there is reproduction or reproductive abilities in heaven, which would then behoove there be female angels, right? And then eventually we're going to get to the goddess, and that's the point.
I think this is a perfect place to do it.
Yeah.
So let me set this up with the Genesis 6 story and something that I found many years ago written by Plato, since Judd just brought him up. This is such an interesting thing because, as early as Justin Martyr, there was beliefs that Plato actually came into contact somehow, whether it's through his ancestor Solon or whatever, with the writings of Moses. And so he's writing in Crataeus, and he's talking about Atlantis, kind of giving the overall story there. And he talks about concerning the allotments of the gods that they portioned out to the whole earth by just allotments. They each received his own, and they settled in their countries. And he's talking about the gods. In other regions, other gods had their allotments and ordered their affairs. So like that language is straight up Deuteronomy 32:7. I mean, it's plagiarized Moses. There's nothing else you can say. This is one of those texts that I guarantee that the fathers were like, yeah, Plato he came into contact with Deuteronomy or something like that, because it's just absolutely too close. But that shows you that we're talking about the same thing then here in Plato that we're talking about in Genesis, which is actually a pretty good argument that Genesis 6 is what we're saying, and it's not the Sethite thing, because this whole thing presupposes that the angel women Nephilim thing is true. When you come to Deuteronomy 32:8 and the sons of God, like that whole thing presupposes Genesis 6, which is why, and the rabbis knew it, which is why they changed the sons of God to the sons of Israel in their text, because they didn't want any of this to be true. So as I keep reading, this is what he says: but inasmuch as Hephaestus and Athena were of like nature, being born of the same father, that's interesting, born of the same father, and agreeing moreover in their love of wisdom and of craftsmanship, they both took for their joint portion this land, Greece, as being naturally congenial and adapted for virtue and wisdom. And so here you have Plato like loving the fact that the Greeks are all wise and everything. And he explains it by the fact that Hephaestus and Athena are the gods that were allotted to Greece. Now, why does that matter? Because Athena is a woman. Mm. And if this is the same worldview that we find in Deuteronomy 32, then here you have, and it's obviously not biblical, but you have clear proof that in very early days, they were considering that the sons of God also had females that were a part of the story. Now, we'll get to in a minute why the Bible really only talks about the sons of God. But I think to get to that, it's important. And what I want to do here, Judd, is just kind of introduce a couple of characters and then just have you riff as long as you want on it. So I don't know why this skips people's attention, but one of the main deities in the Old Testament is Asherah. And she's the consort of El, who's the father of the divine council. So she's actually the one who gives birth to the 70 sons. What's even stranger is that when El kind of is out of the picture, Baal ends up taking her as his consort. So there's Asherah is this huge, huge problem in Israelite worship. And there's a second one I want to bring up, which is Artemis of the Ephesians. And this is also called Diana. In the book of she doesn't show up by name in Ephesians, the letter, but in the book of Acts, she shows up because when Paul goes there, there's this whole riot that has caused the people to say that, you're destroying the temple of Artemis of the Ephesians, destroying her worship. So it just so happens that this goddess had this insane temple at Ephesus that was actually one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was known everywhere. It was in this amazing temple. So the reason I bring this up is because in Ephesus and Ephesians, when we get to that really important passage in Ephesians 6, where Paul says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities in the heavenly places. If you were at Ephesus, the first thing, not the last, but the first thing that would have come into your mind is Artemis, the goddess, because that's what that town was all about. That's who they worshiped. Her worship was so all-encompassing, not only in Ephesus, but surrounding, that some have said that her worship was second only to Zeus himself. She was a big deal. And she's a woman. And Asherah is a woman. And these are the goddesses, and they're in the Bible. And we need to deal with it. So
we knew there were demigods, and there were obviously females. I mean, what's the difference between a goddess and maybe a female Nephilim?
Yeah, so these would be the equivalent of the sons of God. These would be the parents of the Nephilim.
Okay.
Which is why I brought up the Plato thing, because in Deuteronomy 32:7 and 8, it's the sons of God who are allotted to the nations. And the Bible only talks about the males, but here we have Plato talking about a female equivalent. If you go to, I think the Greek counterpart to the 70 sons of God, it's really the 12 Olympians of the pantheon. And those Olympians are six guys and 6 girls, and they pair off and they have children in the myths. Sometimes they produce children asexually, which is really weird. Sometimes they produce them biologically, though. And that's all kind of stuff we can get into, but I'm sure Judd probably has a ton of stuff to say here.
Well, yeah, I think the clear analog is that the Olympians are, I tend to think that they're kind of the mid and lower ranking sons of God, whereas you had the kind of higher ranking sons of God like Shemyadza and Azazel. These would have been your titans. But Doug also brought up something really interesting the other day about a potential explanation for some of the demigods and perhaps even the gods just below the Olympians being a result of a second incursion of the sons of God, which isn't necessarily explicated anywhere, but it's sort of implied because you have giants after the flood too, right? And we're already we and both the ancient audience were already sort of familiar with how that worked. There's a divine component there. There's divine pedigree, angelic pedigree.
We do have the Greeks who talk about, the whole titanomachy, where Zeus puts Kronos into Tartarus.
Right.
Right. And then that's exactly what Peter's talking about in 2 Peter when he talks about the angels that are thrown into Tartarus. It's the exact same story. So if that's the case, and in Greek mythology, you have the Titans would have been the equivalent of the sons of God before the flood. then at least their conception of it is that the Olympians were the sons of God that were after the flood.
After the flood. Yep.
And so that actually really does explain a kind of a second incursion. Whether or not that's true or not, I mean, it's a Greek thing, so that it is what it is. But nevertheless, it still is, and you have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it also lines up with Deuteronomy 32:7, right? It's not a big jump to think that these rebellious sons of God that have governorship over the nations then do the same thing that the Watchers did, and they procreate. I mean, and we find that in mythology, right?
Yeah, and Plato is actually saying that some of the Olympians were put over Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not the Titans. I mean, and so that also fits after the flood. That's exactly what Moses is talking about.
Do you think that a lot of these cultures, because like when you watch Ancient Apocalypse, and for example, one of his opening scenes is just talking about how all these cultures have the same stories. Like they all talk about a flood narrative. They all have these similar themes.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting to me that Christian apologists will have no problem going to comparative religion and saying, hey, look, there's 400 flood myths all over the world. That helps you see that the Bible's not making this up. But then when you try and do that with what we're doing here, they're like, you can't do that.
Yeah, that's off limits. Wait, and it's ironic too, because the flood myth, it is presenting, it as part of its, literary and mythological baggage it's got all the divine council stuff. It's got all the giant stuff. It's got the worldwide flood. It's the myth that ties all of that together. And so it's broadly applicable. That's one of the ironies of it. I agree with you, Doug. And, we could probably spin off 5 or 6 other shows just on that topic alone about how, comparative religion and mythology get brought into the discussion of flood myths. But boy, you venture past those boundaries and you're in some muddy water.
I would say on the same note too, guys, like when you go back into civilization, right? You talk about Sumeria, the oldest civilization, right? You have these very important goddesses, right?
Yeah.
Asherah, who was in the Bible, and Astarte and Aneth, right? That's Canaanite. And then in Sumeria, you have Inanna and Ishtar. And Ishtar ends up in space in the Bible. Then in Egyptian, you have Isis. What I think is fascinating is in the oldest civilizations, and we know that God divided the nations, right, among the sons of God. And we're going to talk about that in a bit, about how that doesn't necessarily mean all sons, I would believe is where we're going with that. But in each of these very, very ancient civilizations, their deities, by and large, include the feminine. And then we find some of these characters in the Bible. And we know, as we talked about, that in the Mosaic books, that Israel is geopolitically and very much geography-wise adjacent to a lot of these religions. In fact, they end up worshiping some of these gods, right? And when they turn their back on Yahweh. And some of these gods are what we talked about, El and Baal. And then, of course, you have Asherah, and you have Inanna, and you have these gods that we would assume to be, if you want to take, and this is a thought exercise, but you want to take, a very good hypothesis. You say these were some of those that were given the allotment of the nations. That would make sense to me, especially when we go all the way back to Gen 6 and say they reproduced. I mean, this is where I want to hammer this home. They reproduced, right? And so if we're unless we buy the poof theory, then they had to be able to do things that, in order to procreate.
You're right that it's old, but it's much older than that. It's much older than that. We're talking about prehistoric civilization, early Neolithic civilization that predates even the Sumerians, going back to places like Çatalhöyük and Natufian and Jericho, in the 10th millennium BC, and Göbekli Tepe and carry on.
Göbekli Tepe, yep. Göbekli Tepe.
Venus of Willendorf statue that is found literally all over Eurasia. This statue of the divine feminine, she's depicted faceless, with large breasts, and is pregnant. And so this idea of the mother goddess, that those statues date to as early as between 30,000 and 20,000 BC. So those female entities interacting with humanity, and that makes it, another difficulty of this in this thought exercise is putting some sort of concrete chronology.
There you go.
As to where the precedents are. When did these experiences start happening? They're quite archaic.
I think the reason we've started this podcast and the reason we got into these topics is because, when you have this hierarchy of characters, then you begin to understand the biblical story more, right? And Luke and I have uncovered so many different creatures. I mean, it just expands. The list gets longer every day. So I think what we're talking about is, to me, I want to have the bigger discussion, which is, I think we have a weird view of the Trinity. I think we have a weird view of angels. I think we have a weird view of aliens. And I think these are all connected. And we have a hard time believing in all these concepts because we have this very narrow view of the spiritual supernatural realm, whatever you want to call it. Half of Christians still, debate the Trinity. What is it? Is Jesus the Son of God, or isn't he? And what are angels? Are they like us? And here's a question: before Jesus becomes a human, what form is he? Because when he has his resurrected body, does he change again when he gets to heaven?
Yeah. So, the idea seems to be when he takes his resurrected body, that becomes the same, the archetype body of what we will all have for eternity when we die. So there's no reason to think that Jesus somehow loses that body or changes it into something else. But before he came here, if the Old Testament is allowed to say anything at all, somehow he took on the form of the angel of the Lord. And it wasn't just a poof thing. It was like a permanent thing. Now you can take that question back farther and say, well, what was going on before he created anything? And those are questions that I just have no way of, I don't think we could ever find a way to answer those kind of questions. But nevertheless, in some ways our view of the Trinity is kind of warped here because it's almost impossible to talk about one way because it's utterly unique. I mean, you've got one God and three persons. This is the claim of the Trinity that are the one God. And how does that even work? Well, you can work it out logically, but you can't really work it out much any other ways. And so you have to try and think about it. And I think that we're right to say things like the one God is without sex. He doesn't have sex. He's a sexless spirit being that contains the fullness and totality of what he imbues into humanity with male and female. He obviously contains much more than that, but if he's trying to communicate masculine and feminine and he's sexless, how in the world would he do that to the creation? Well, that's just the God part. What about the Father, Son, and Spirit part? So the Father is not a woman and the Son is not a woman. The Son is very clearly a man, and the Father is very clearly male. This bothers a lot of people because they'll read things like the Sophia, the wisdom in Proverbs 8, and how it's personified as a woman, and they'll many people have done this. The Gnostics were one of many that turned the Sophia into like a feminine third person of the Trinity or something like that. But the fact of the matter is Jesus somehow embodies this because in him is all wisdom and knowledge, as Paul tells us. So, it's a tough thing to talk about, but when we get to the idea of communicating this to the creation, it's just very bizarre to me to think that he would create all the animals, male and female, humans, male and female. And I think Timothy Alberino is right about this when he talks about the angels as our elder race. I think it's just a great insight. But to think then that the elder race is only male, and if they predate us, like Job seems to say, so for how long is it only males going on? And how in the world is God communicating this, the whole feminine side of what he is in his totality to them? Like, did they only start to realize that once God made women, human women? The Genesis 6 story is not really about lust. It's about the seed war. It's about them trying to destroy the coming of Christ. So it's, we kind of act like, oh, well, they just lusted after all women, and probably they did, but it's so much more than that. And if it's much more than that, then can't we imply, based on the fact that we know that there are goddesses, that there, in fact, are female entities that are part of the heavenly realm and even part of the gods and part of the, the angelic realm? I still don't understand what the problem with that is.
Yeah. I mean, I love all these conversations, and I think it seems like human beings are interacting with certain titles, right? Certain job titles. Like for instance, if you're lost in the wilderness, you're not going to run into a doctor and a lawyer and you're going to run into a hunter. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And maybe human beings are only interacting with male angels because that's their job title. They're specific.
Right? That's the fun. Yeah, that's the function.
Watchers.
The stork women, for example, they're not saying anything. They're moving the basket somehow. So it seems to be a different kind of a function.
The ladies are the movers. We should try that down here. I moved everything last time we moved.
And it's possible too that it could be sort of simple where Satan is tempting these watcher angels. Oh, look at those ladies down there. It's easy pickings. It's like Luke in Japan. He's like a god over there. He's like 6'6" and he's walking around and
just just I got facial hair and height, Yeah, absolutely.
But you know what I'm saying? They could just come down here and they're literal gods among men. And what woman wouldn't want to be with? There could be some simple lusting desires as well. They wanted, oh, this is interesting. It's hard for some Christians because it's like, how can they think like we think? Why would they think like we think? And it's like, well, why do we think the way we do? It kind of goes in a circle, and I just don't understand. I think so many people are hung up because they have this preconceived understanding of everything that's spiritual is like this weird dream. It doesn't even really exist. Not like it does down here. We go to church, we talk about all these things, and then we just go back to our mundane lives, and we forget everything we just talked about. As if it's not real, as if the afterlife isn't real. I think these topics are really kind of pressing on people, especially as the UFO disclosure happens, that there is a physical part of all this. They're building craft like a Ford assembly line somewhere, and they're coming here. That's just a hard fact for half the people listening to our show to swallow. We have many of them, and we don't even know how they work. We don't even know where the metals come from. Half the time, we can't even get inside of these things. We don't even know how they work. So they're being built somewhere.
Let's bring it to the fore then. Let's bring it to more recent times and what pertinence these ideas and concepts might have. And I'm thinking about things like the modern environmental movement, and specifically the biodiversity treaty from the early 1990s, where it's just written in plain sight for anybody to see. People can go look this up. It's public domain. They have to print their playbook before they do anything. There are elements within the biodiversity treaty that push environmentalism as this new religion.
Gaia.
The push being to get people to engage more in ancient nature paganism, and so those including goddess worship. In fact, identifying the Earth with the Greek Titan Gaia, it was the Greek mythological embodiment of the Earth, and so this is a thought experiment. If we can look at why people should be thinking about these kinds of things, in addition to just the strictly theological, and even in this context, there are theological ramifications for something like the 1991 Biodiversity Treaty. They've certainly the powers that be certainly have done this, whatever appellation we want to give to the powers that be. But the push is already here now, particularly with the fertile ground that it's found in the postmodern world. Because there's no objective truth now under postmodernism, right? Everything's its own truth. It's the ultimate hermeneutic. And so that's why I say that, culturally, socially speaking, in fact, spiritually speaking, the modern society is fertile ground for an embracing of this goddess that has worn many faces. Some of those personalities we've talked about tonight, like Asherah, like the Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots from Revelation, like Inanna in Mesopotamian mythology. So we're at a point now to where those rites in a repackaged format are finding expression in real space and time right in front of us. So it's a timely topic for the church to be talking about, and it just doesn't have traction.
Yeah, I was trying to find where I read this from him, and in my little search engine, it came up with a YouTube video that's called "There's Only One Goddess, Gaia, and Al Gore is her prophet." Oh, so I bring this up because, very pragmatically, the whole environmentalism movement has been touted publicly as this scientific thing, right? But behind the scenes, and this goes to him, it goes to all kinds of people like you just mentioned, Judd. This is a pagan goddess religion posing for the public in our culture as science. And it's anything but science. Anything but science. This is the goddess rearing her head right in front of us. And once she gets enough power, then she has no problem telling you exactly who she is. But it's been subversive for decades and decades. And it's only in more recent times that people have really started to recognize what's actually going on.
Do you think that maybe the goddesses have a different sort of set of skills to seduce humans to do things that maybe some of the, I guess...
Like Liam Neeson says, like a very certain specific set of skills?
Yeah, exactly. The goddesses have a certain set of skills.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you look at Satan in the garden, I mean, he's tempting you with words and ideas and thoughts. He's putting those thoughts into your head. That's a very different kind of thing than like sexual seduction that you find with women. When women are portrayed as harlots in the Bible, that's kind of what they do. And that's kind of feminine wiles versus the way that men tempt people to do things. And you brought up roles earlier, Nate, and I think that's a great observation that if there are feminine, female kind of deities, that they would have a whole different way of seducing people than the male deities would. And we, in fact, find that throughout history in the worship of the goddess.
I mean, men and women desire the same things, and we have two very different ways of going about getting them. That's what we know, right? You know, and you know, we talked a little bit about Jordan Peterson and how he's kind of laid out no matter where we are in society, you still have men doing these types of jobs and women doing these types of jobs. And he tries to break down that's just how we're wired. We're just different beings, but we desire similar things. And I just wonder if, like I said, if you're comparing the two kingdoms, maybe some of these goddesses are using that seduction to lure in kings. Then that is their territory. That is their domain. They seduce a king and then they have him and they get their principality through seduction.
Judd, what is the goddess? When we talk about like the goddess, not you know, just lesser female deities, but like the goddess, what are we talking about?
So I did my master's thesis on a community of neo-pagans. And so there were a number of years I immersed myself in this mythology, you know, just the study of this mythology. And it's almost a kind of dualism when you think about it. And this is true of not just modern neo-paganism, but it's also true of the most archaic kind of goddess conceptualization, in a general sense that there was a masculine, a divine masculine, and that there was a divine feminine. And so it's the concept in that context of the goddess is that she encompasses all things feminine. She's the embodiment of everything feminine, whether it's human femininity or cultural femininity or, you know, anything that could be identified as feminine. She's the supernatural embodiment of all of that. And that's kind of the concept in terms of religious thought that you're looking at, not only in classical antiquity or the ancient world, like with the Roman Bona Dea or the Magna Mater. You know, these are ancient concepts, were very broad, very general concepts. Even the Venus of Willendorf that I brought up a moment ago, it's probably one of the oldest material that we have, diagnostic material, where we can identify those very general, broad, feminine, supernatural concepts. And, you know, here we are. I like the way Doug put it. Here we are today. That goddess, that entity, is rearing its head again in the guise of scientism and specifically the environmental movement, the modern environmental movement, or climate change, or whatever the is now. It's really all the same. But that's when we talk about a general kind of idea, the goddess, the divine feminine. That these are the kind of ideas that are encapsulated within that concept.
Is that the same thing that we would refer to as the Queen of Heaven?
I think so. Well, I mentioned a moment ago that the modern environmental movement identifies the earth as Gaia. I think that's just a rebranding in a way of this very powerful female entity that's had such a cultural sway wherever she's ensconced, whether it's Babylon or Egypt Greece or
Israel.
Yeah.
Jeremiah talks about the Queen of Heaven a couple of times. And I found a couple of commentaries in my favorite book, the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. That's what I read for fun. If any of you want it, it only costs $10,000. It is a retirement plan. It's like buying a house. But there's a couple of quotes that are interesting. Isaac of Antioch, who's a 5th century church father, equated the Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah with Venus, which would make Bananarama happy.
Hey.
There we go.
Also, Venus is Ishtar, if we're going to go backward.
Yep. Same thing.
Yeah.
But also, there's another interesting one. Epiphanius, who's a 4th century father, criticized the women of Phrygia and Scythia and Arabia on account of their habit of adoring the Virgin Mary as a goddess and offering to her a certain kind of cake. Well, the reason why that's so interesting is because that's exactly what Jeremiah says that they were doing to the Mother of Heaven, the Queen of Heaven. So there's nothing new under the sun.
Didn't you say that myrtle branches were part of the rites?
There you go.
Yeah, well, that's right. We were in a part 1 that will never be aired. Nate, you had brought up Esther, the book of Esther, and that reminded me because you were talking about roles and femininity, right?
Yeah.
And as I'm recalling, and that they, she spent a year in beauty treatments, and it instantly struck me that Esther's name is Star, and that her original name was Myrtle, her Hebrew name. And the reason why that matters is because the book of Esther is actually kind of the last play of Act 1 of the Old Testament of the Nephilim story, because Mordecai, her uncle, his name means little man, and the enemy of the story, Haman, is an Agagite, and Agag is descended from the Amalekites, which are Rephaim. And in fact, to emphasize the point, he makes these giant gallows that he wants to kill Mordecai on, and then he ends up getting killed on himself. And the point is that you have the little man, God's man, the one you would never suspect, who's able to destroy the offspring of the Nephilim. So you've got the whole worldview, the supernatural worldview, embedded in the story, and it's through names. And then you have Esther, who both of her names are deeply connected to the divine council through myrtle trees. It's in Zechariah chapter 1 that the divine council horsemen are riding through the myrtle trees, which are kind of a symbol of the council. And then her name is, of course, Star. That's all about the gods, because that's literally what they're called. So yeah, you find this everywhere, and it's just interesting to me that Esther, of course, is a woman. She's the embodiment of the female.
She spent a year getting smoky eye, Nate. A year making her, just giving her the best smoky eye.
She was just learning that walk, get the king's way, And
it's kind of like a weird David and Goliath if you think about it now. Like you have the short guy and
no,
the
it's
big
exactly
guy.
what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, you got the short. Chalk went up for the short kings.
You have the same story in Joshua too, with his mighty men, which are just average, ordinary guys.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a couple lessons here. Like, don't name your son Mordecai unless you want to be a little guy. But he could still slay giants. Like
and lay low on the smoky eye. Too much. You never know.
Much. You spent a year doing it. You better get it right.
My.
There he is.
Here's one more kind of practical thing. Have you guys heard of a guy named Jonathan Cahn?
Yeah.
So he recently wrote a book, The Return of the Gods.
I thought you were going to talk about John Gray, who wrote Men Are
Jonathan
from
Gray.
Mars.
Yeah, he's
Women Are from
guy.
Venus.
Is that guy still even alive? I don't know. Jonathan Cahn brings up Asherah in this book, and under the context of the Return of the Gods, and he makes a couple pretty interesting points. One is that she's connected directly to the rainbow. She's the goddess of the rainbow. And in the context of that, and this is in Mesopotamian literature, and in the context of that, she also identifies herself as both the female and the male. So she ends up having this weird androgyny thing going on. Really bizarre. And in fact, she's a highly sexual goddess, but she's also a goddess of war. Almost like an Amazonian.
It's like Bruce Jenner.
From Lesbos, right? I mean, so you've got all this kind of weird stuff going on with the goddess that This is one of the reasons why it's kind of speculative in terms of, do these creatures mate, or do they reproduce asexually, or is there none of that? Like, what in the world is going on? Because when you come to a creature like Ishtar and this goddess Asherah, like, what in the world is she? And so Brian Godawa actually, just for a kind of a novel trick in his Nephilim series, I think he has probably Azazel, but I don't remember exactly who it is. But it's one of the early gods, the sons of God, and he has him basically acting as a transvestite, taking on the form of Ishtar or Asher or whatever, but really it's a man. And it's kind of a clever way to bring in the whole transsexual, asexual weirdness. But going back to Khan, he brings this up because he basically says, if she were to return today, what would it look like in a culture? And self-evident, it looks exactly like what's been happening in the last few years on hyper steroids.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've done on the show a lot is put these complex terms in more practical, a practical way where you can sit down and you can think about it in a different light. That for some reason the church has changed the way we think about a lot of these things. And like I like how you talked about in the episode, like bread from heaven. Well, bread is grains. Grains is eating. Eating is biology. Lusting after human women. Luke and I often feel like, what we're trying to do is help people understand the blurry creatures that are out there, that they physically manifest. And there's many of them. And a lot of people think that the ones they don't understand are just, let's lump them into one category. There can't be female angels. There can't be male angels mating with humans, and there can't be Bigfoot, and there can't be Dogman, and there can't be the Hat Man and the Black-Eyed Children, and the list goes on and on and on. I don't know why it's a lot of skepticism from the church. It seems as though somewhere along the line, if we're thinking Doc Brown, somewhere in the alternate, it's skewed to this alternate Christian theology that we all believe now. And the ancient people had this vast understanding of all these things that we have lost.
And really what we're trying to do is, really kind of double the size of that crazy world. Because if some people think that it's only males, now what happens if all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of females? You doubled the size of that supernatural realm, and you've allowed yourself to consider different kinds of temptations and seductions that can come to you, can come to a culture, can come to the church through the feminine fallen creatures.
Most of the goddesses that we see, in antiquity, it's very specific in sort of the things they represent. It is seduction and fertility, which obviously the woman fertility, but then it's the siren. It's calling men with this sweet seduction to their death, right? It's a very feminine. And if you think about the gods being corrupt and wanting to corrupt humanity and rebelling against the King of Heaven, against the King of Kings, against Yahweh, right? Then it's like the deities that are masculine are gods of war, and it's the temptation of Satan. It's pride. It's possessions. It's ownership of things. And then when you get into the sort of the goddess area, and I was thinking about this as we're talking, it's like it's very sexualized and seductive, and but both sides are ruination of humanity, right? We don't there's no good to be done. They just operate in very different, and you might say binary ways, right? And
well, but even that's not universal, because like Athena, it gets really complicated because
it does.
You got
there are women who've got a war, yeah, supposedly
male roles for females in some capacities, because Athena, one of her iconic symbol is the helm and the spear that she wields. Mm-hmm. Inanna is a war goddess. She's the goddess of promiscuity in Mesopotamia, but she's very clearly this war goddess as well.
But they seduce. I feel like they're in ways that seem to be very binary. So that's what I think is interesting, And then you can talk about one of the great philosophers of our generation, Austin Powers, said, "That's a man, baby."
Right.
Well, think about the Old Testament language and the close association between idolatry and adultery. the sexual connotations that come from that. I mean, you can think that, of course, you can think of it both ways. If you're thinking about the wife of God, then I suppose the adultery would be with the Baals. But if you're thinking about Israel as a man, which often Israel is personified as a man, then what would be the counterpart? It would be the Asherahs. And it doesn't; those things don't make sense unless you have male-female entities.
Yeah, certainly the perverted conceptualization of that is evident in the archaeological record. Again, if I could ever so stealthily refer to part 1 that will never be aired, I brought up some archaeological evidence in Israel that clearly, you've got evidence of that idolatrous adultery in stone, because there were reprobate Hebrews that were worshiping in some of these Canaanite cults that represented Yahweh with an Asherah consort in statuary. So that, to me, Doug, I think you probably agree, that's a glaring example of that rendered in stone.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think in our modern arrogance that we know more than the ancients, and we talk about this on our show a lot, Nate. In our arrogance in postmodernism and post-enlightenment and in this academic era, we think we can better understand things, and we change it. I think the implications here are very important, and I don't want to miss these. That if we are to think that heaven is
Halo
is just
2,
a big
man.
sausage
Halo
party,
2,
for lack of a better term,
no,
a bunch of angelic dudes hanging out, They're playing Halo 1 because we all did in college, right? We have this idea that's just a bunch of dudes in heaven in the angelic realm hanging out. But I think if we were just to pragmatically look at the evidence, both historical, archaeological, especially scriptural, that it makes a lot of sense that perhaps we have female angels in the angelic realm in this thought experiment. I think based upon what we see in adjacent cultures and what we see in goddess worship, what we see in pantheons, and what we can sort of see is implicitly connected between these two and its relation to the sons of God, the Genesis 6 event, and the divine council. I think it's a compelling argument, and I think it's something to really think about, especially in light of the times we live in. And I think that's important to talk about. As much as we talk about antiquity, guys, these things matter and resonate today.
Yeah, there may be no more important topic to talk about
Agreed.
in terms of pragmatic and what's happening in the culture than what we're talking about tonight.
And it is for Christians too. You have like guys like Ken Ham who are just like tweeting out, and, they didn't mate with women, and he just had all these list of character traits that he was a matter of fact about. And here he is, like one of the bigger guys in this scene, but you can see that he doesn't accept and all these other things too. So I think these are important because it's kind of like dominoes. If you cut off some of these ideas, then you continue to go through scripture and you have to delete anything that doesn't sort of fit the narrative. And I think my heart on this episode is trying to help Christians understand, what I think is coming, which is obviously, like you guys are talking about, crazy gender confusion. But I also think this denial that there are other beings that are flying around. And Christians have these just hang-ups of these complicated topics, and I think that it's great that you guys are talking about this because it helps people trust it more. Okay, there's other stuff. There's possibly, a whole hierarchy of beings, and there could be male and female. And Luke, I'm gonna bring up Sasquatch one last time. The first one
you have to get your third one in. It's like we're watching Super Troopers, and you got to say meow like 10 times, right? Like, listen, meow.
She was a lady just walking along the beach.
Oh, here we go.
I mean, there's female Sasquatches. Why can't there?
I mean, it's pretty evident in the video that Patty had yams. So,
well, gentlemen, I think we're going downhill from here. Appreciate you guys coming on. I know it's kind of a weird topic. It's way beyond my pay grade. I'm not a historian, obviously, and it's hard for me to follow along. So I appreciate.
And you're also a ginger, which puts you at a double disadvantage.
I know. I've got probably some corrupted bloodline somewhere in there.
But it is your name of the show, Blurry Creatures, and there's no doubt that these are some of the blurriest of all the creatures that are out there.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be weird if heaven is this realm, and forever there's no female deities up there, and all of a sudden humanity is rescued and brought to heaven, and all of a sudden there's all these women on the scene. That might create a weird environment. You know what I'm saying? It's like an all boys school, and all of a sudden the Catholic girls' school. We're gonna merge them. They're coming in. The dudes wouldn't know what to do.
Nuns would
Luke
be real mad. Yeah.
There's a T-shirt here somewhere. Heaven is cold.
Go ahead.
I like it, Judd. I think you get 10% for the big guy. You know what I mean?
But this is how this is the deep thoughts that my brain has. You guys have way deeper thoughts. So appreciate you coming on the show. We're always trying to figure out more context to the weird blurry creatures that we hear about that make no sense. That so many people are skeptical about.
Yeah, and I think too, I would add like that we go back to Genesis 6, right, guys, and this is really where a lot of it, the seed war, and you know, from the prophecy of Gen 3, this is where it happens, and I think it's hard for a lot of people because you know, of course, we have the Sethite view, right, which is taught in every seminary in the United States for sure. I don't know about the rest of the world, but you have this whole Sethite view, and it's just contrary to what the church fathers and to what Jesus himself. And to what was taught thousands of years before that. And you need to make sense of how pragmatically this happened. And to extrapolate on that to what we see in culture in antiquity, I think all of those things really line up. And so I think this is such an important conversation because, you know, right, wrong, in between, right? I think it only behooves us to really try to understand this and wrap our arms around it. And when we bring in, you know, guys like you that spent the 10,000 hours, and we talk about, you know, extra biblical things like Plato and Enoch and these other places that provide, you know, additional context to the scripture. Those are things that were, and I want to remind people, those are things that were accessible to the people of the time, right? They were read. They were well read. This is what they did. They read the scrolls. They didn't pull up their iPad and watch Netflix or listen to their, you know, to whatever on Audible or play games on their phones or whatever. They read. They knew these things, right? This was common knowledge, and I think that's lost on us sometimes. So that's why it's a long way of saying this conversation is so important, and I'm just grateful that you guys spent time with us now 2 nights in a row on the same topic.
I mean, we're not trying to give all the answers, and there are difficult passages, you know, like. What does Jesus mean when he says that the angels don't marry and are not given in marriage? I mean, I think that we come to that passages like that, which are hard. I'm not going to lie, but we come to it with presupposition, and in that case, it's probably the presupposition. Well, that there's no female angels, so that solves that problem, or angels are sexless, so that solves that problem, or whatever people come to. And all I want to say is, look, there's always going to be problem passages for everybody. But there's also a lot of things that you avoid sometimes in a passage like that when you have a presupposition that if you consider other things, then it seems to me that you have to be a little bit more honest and say and try and find out maybe there's something else that could be happening there that could answer that question of what Jesus is talking about that isn't what I thought. And that's really kind of what I want people to take away from this is. There's a whole world out there that we're trying to expose in terms of female deities that I think we should be taking seriously and that we should bring to difficult passages.
I agree.
As we try and interpret the world around us.
As Mike would say, if it's weird, it matters, or it's important, right? And
well, it's all weird. I think that's the thing. It's all weird. This whole thing is weird. Everything we hear on the show, it's strange. I think we make it not weird so we can process it. The Sethite view is, let's make it not weird. Let's strip it down. I just feel like that's the case. It's just this whole thing is strange.
Well, it's not that they feel like it. Like that's literally what Augustine and Chrysostom and Calvin and Luther said. They said, "This is insane. I don't believe it." That's what they said.
Yeah.
So that's their argument.
And we do. We lean on our own understanding. We try to figure these things out, and then we cast away. You know, you do a show like this for a long time, and you're just like, man, it's just bananas. I mean, everything's just. The stuff that comes at us every day, 100 links.
It's Bananarama.
You're like...
It's Bananarama all the time.
I mean, it's like, you go crazy. Sometimes you just got to go for a walk and check a baseball game or something because you're out. And gentlemen, you guys are great. Thank you for always coming on our show and just making our listeners angry. We get the hate mail.
I don't know why. They're not angry. They
might get angry.
They just clamor for more Doug and more Judd. These are not angry. These are not angry episodes. This one might be. which is always fun. Stir them up, right? It's new wineskins, guys. It's the idea that we need to stretch our paradigms. As Doug, you said, we presuppose a lot of things that perhaps are cultural dogma that don't necessarily find their roots in Scripture, but become comfortable answers for uncomfortable questions. And I think it's important to get uncomfortable with the Scripture and with our faith in order to stretch our wineskins, if you will, to go with that metaphor. And I'm just grateful for you guys, because you know what? There are a shortage of, I was about to quote Princess Bride, and I don't know why that even happened in my brain, but I'm not going to make that quote. That doesn't fit. that doesn't fit here, guys. But but my point is, there's a shortage of scholars and pastors and thinkers in this world that have the courage to deviate outside of the box and to ask some of the questions and address some of the things in Scripture that are hard. And so, you know I speak for our audience and for Nate and I when I say we're grateful for you guys. I mean, we're beyond grateful for your friendship on a personal level, but on a professional level, we're grateful that you guys have the courage to take these things head on, because there are not a lot of people in the space that do that, right? Because you put yourself in a position for the mainstream to, you know, you open yourself to trolls and everything else to say that you guys are, you know, or we collectively are on a tangent or off base. But the reality is that we don't increase our faith unless we question some of the things, and we try to discuss some of the things that are important, and you guys really bring it all the time. So we're grateful for you guys. You guys are OGs. You've been here since the beginning, and man, frankly, we love you guys. And so it's a treat. It's a treat to do this 2 nights in a row, as much as it was a pain, as much as this feels like Groundhog Day. I think these conversations, I can't iterate how much I think these are important, and the work that you guys are both individually doing is so important, and collectively doing, right? We have a Serpent Mound book coming out. If I can encourage you at all, like in the way that I know it resonates with at least our small community, that you guys are running a good race, and just keep on keeping on.
Well, thanks, man. Yeah, we love you guys, and we're so glad to be able to be part of the show.
You're
Absolutely
stuck now. BlurryCon 2 and everything in between. You're stuck. Guess what? We know where you live. We send you shirts. I'll come find you.
Never.